So, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the InterPARES Trust AI Symposium on the Smart Archives. My name is Hrvoje Stančić. I'm from the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, University of Zagreb. So you could tell that I'm a local organizer of this event. It is my honor and my privilege to welcome you to today's symposium. And I hope we will all have a fruitful time and that we all will learn a lot from each other. We have an excellent program of esteemed speakers today, and they will be announced by my colleague Corinne Rogers, which I'm inviting to take the floor now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hrvoje. And welcome, everyone. I hope people at the back of the room can hear. Perfect. Okay, I'm going to introduce the speakers. I'll give a brief introduction. Each speaker has approximately 20 minutes to talk. And if we stay on time, we will have time for one or two questions, if there are questions. But we do have a very tight timeline today, so I'm not going to be generous about allowing people to ask questions if the time is looking tight. So I'd like to begin by introducing Luciana Durante. Luciana has since 1987 been a professor of archival theory, diplomatics, and digital records in the master's and doctoral archival programs of the School of Information of the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. And since 2011, she has been an affiliate professor at the University of Washington in Seattle, United States. Professor Durante is director of the UBC Center for the International Study of Contemporary Records and Archives, and since 1998 has been the principal investigator of the InterPARES project. She's published extensively on archival and diplomatics theory and on the use of their concepts for understanding the products of new technology. Since 2015, she has been the chair of the Canadian Government Standards Board Committee for Electronic Records as Documentary Evidence. Please welcome Luciana Durante.
Thank you, Corinne. Hello, everybody. Pleasure to see all of you. So 25 years of InterPARES in 20 minutes. Okay, so in 98, we had some pressing questions with the growing use of digital, then called electronic records. And the questions were, is the theory of the record still valid in the digital environment? How do we keep digital records authentic over the long term across technologies? So we created an archival network, research network called InterPARES, which in Latin means among peers, with the idea that it was going to be a collaborative effort of people in very different disciplines, but all sharing the same purpose. So to express the purpose of the research, InterPARES was made into an acronym, International Research on Permanent Authentic Records in Electronic Systems. So the general goal of InterPARES over 25 years has been to ensure that digital records be created reliable and accurate and preserved authentic for as long as needed by the creator and society at large across technological change. InterPARES has been funded by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada and matching funds from UBC and all the partners in cash or in kind since 98. So the goal of InterPARES 1 and 2 was really development of theory and methods. And in InterPARES 1, we were focusing on databases and office systems, while in InterPARES 2, we were focusing on dynamic, experiential, and interactive systems. InterPARES 1 mostly related to government. InterPARES 2 involved records which were generated in the course of artistic, scientific, and e-government activities. So Then we created lots of products and we thought we had solved the problems of the world and everything was fine until we got a number of organizations from uh, third world countries, but also from first world countries who didn't have enough resources in personnel, in technology, and in money to actually implement what we had proposed as the perfect digital environment for the long-term preservation of authentic digital records. So we created InterPARES 3. And InterPARES 3 was about enabling public and private archival organizations and programs with limited resources to preserve over the long term authentic records that satisfy the requirements of their stakeholders and society's needs for inadequate records of the past. So how did we do this? Well, we decided to take the products of the first two phases and work on them to make them affordable. And so what were the products? Well, the first one was a policy framework, which was made of 13 principles for the creator and 13 principles for the preservers that every record creating and preserving organization had to adopt. Then we developed creators guidelines. So guidelines for those who produce records for any kind of organization. But the purpose was to help individuals and small communities of practice. In reality, we learned much later, they were the primary instrument used by governments. So it reached much further than we intended. Preserver guidelines, same story. We created them for the people who cannot afford to have archivists, do not have resources, but in fact were heavily used by government archives. The most important product of InterPARES 1 was the benchmark and baseline requirements for authenticity. Benchmark requirements for records managers and baseline requirements for archivists in historical archives. We also created file format selection guidelines. Now you would say, well, that was several years ago, the world has changed. No, because the guidelines are about the principles that you have to think about when you choose a format. So it is not the discussion of the existing format at the time, but it is the discussion of the process of selection of the formats to use. The terminology database composed of a glossary which defines the term used in all the documents issued by InterPARES. So what we as InterPARES team mean by a certain term. The dictionary which shows the definitions that exist for that same term in a number of other glossaries and dictionaries, etc., especially cross disciplines. And then ontologies, the ontology of the record, the ontology of trustworthiness, etc. We also created two record preservation models. One is the chain of preservation, which is based on the life cycle of the records, so the concept of the life cycle. But then, of course, we had Australians in our team. They didn't like that. So we decided to also have a model of preservation based on the continuum concept. So it's called business-driven record keeping. And then people can choose what they want to choose. And the final products of InterPARES 1 and 2 were two books that you can find on the InterPARES websites. Everything that is on the public site of the InterPARES website is not covered by copyright purposely so that everybody can pick them up, use as they want, modify a paragraph here and the paragraph there in order to use them for their organization and adapt them. So that's what we wanted. We wanted usable stuff. InterPARES 3 created lots of general studies. Here I have colored the ones that were the most effective, the cost-benefit models, ethical models. The education models became the International Council on Archives education models, metadata application profiles, the terminology database of the ICA. Now it includes 26 languages, and guidelines for email preservation. And then we again had solved all the problems and we thought it's over. We don't need to do anything anymore. But then the cloud came about and everything came into discussion again. And so InterPARES 4 was about trusting records that are entrusted in the cloud. And we conducted studies according to research domains. So we studied the infrastructure of the cloud, the legal issues, security, controls, access, but also education. How do we educate people to use the cloud in a proper way? Policy, resources, social issues, and terminology forever there. Now, it's interesting that we felt the need to create, not just to issue, not just a book, a generic book as before that covers all the products of our research, because we realized that while some of the products can be used everywhere and are general, other products are specific to certain types of organization or culture. So in the first book you see is the one that includes all the things that are applicable to everybody. Number two is the book that deals with the issues that international organizations encounter when they entrust the record to the cloud. And Hank, who was co-author, is here. Then the third book is about the European environment, especially in the juridical context of Europe, and Hervoy is the primary editor. And the next book is about Latin America and Caribbeans, and Alicia Bernard is the editor. The last book is Africa, so various situations and case studies in Africa. Now, we also collaborated with the Canadian Institute for Information and Privacy Studies to issue a documentary called Duty to Document. And it is accessible on the website of InterPARES 4, which is the InterPARES Trust. Now, again, problem solved. We don't need to do anything anymore. And AI burst in our world. So the goal of the fifth phase of InterPARES is to design, develop, and leverage artificial intelligence to support the ongoing availability and accessibility of trustworthy records. So the objectives are to identify specific AI technology that can address the challenges, to determine the benefits and the risk of using them on records, and to ensure the record concepts and principles inform the development of responsible AI. So basically the focus is on records and archives is not on AI. It's AI for the benefit of records and archives. So we have a short-term approach that focuses on identifying high-impact problems and limitations in records and archives function and applying AI to improve situation. But then we also have a long-term approach, trying to identify the tools that we need in the future to address our needs that keep changing. So the fact that InterPARES is a multinational interdisciplinary endeavor means that we have to start with understanding each other, right? As some of you have observed during the plenary, there are people from archival science, forensics, engineering, computer science, law, etc. Well, we have to learn to talk to each other, starting with the language we use. For example, when we archival professionals talk about records, computer scientists talk about data. And to our two group, data doesn't mean the same thing. It means a different thing. So key to our work for the first 2 years have been tutorials and workshops. So we have tried to teach archival diplomatic theory to computer scientists and the others, and they have tried to teach us AI, a much more challenging task, I think. But we will see how it goes. The studies, our studies are organized by archival functions. So you can see from creation to reference and access, all the archival functions are dealt with, and within each archival function, there are a number of studies. However, there are a couple of studies that affect everything that we do. And today I would like to talk briefly about one of them, which I think is very important. It is the Paradata study. And I am presenting this study in a way on behalf of the researchers who are Pat Frank, Babak, Amit Zadeh, Scott Cameron, Norman Muradian, Alex Richmond, and Mario Beauchamp. The slides that follow are extracted from their presentations. So this is their stuff. So the questions that they asked primarily was, what do we need to, sorry, let me correct this. The questions that they ask are, if when we use an AI tool, an error occurs, or harm is the result of the use, what type of error, what type of harm? Why did it occur? Who should be held responsible? The data curator who provides the data set, the data scientist who create the model, the vendor who supplied the tools, the organizations that implemented the tools, the human users of the output who lacked enough training to understand the possibility of error. Well, the ISO has identified some ways of explaining what it is that we do when we use artificial intelligence. And this is really to protect ourselves, to be held accountable. And what are they? Well, the modes of explanation can be causal, how the tool functions, epistemic, how do we know that it functions, justificatory, on what grounds it functions. But most importantly, we also have to reference institutional and social facts about the implementation of the system. So what were the regulations? What were the standards? What were the organizational processes? So on this basis, we define accountability separately from explainability. So there is lots of discussion about explainable AI, right? But explainable AI focuses on why a given tool produced a given output from a given set of inputs. That's what explainable AI is. But to build accountable AI must consider the individuals who use them, the organizations in the context of which they're used, the environment in which the tools operate. So Paradata is necessary to explain why, how, by whom, and to what effect a given tool was used in a particular context. And Paradata is a word that originally comes from the archaeological field, because think about this, whatever artifact is found during an archaeological process, in order to validate what that is, you must be able to explain how you got there. And also the education of those who did so. So in the context of InterPARES, we have defined paradata as information about the procedures and tools used to create and process information resources, along with information about the operation of those tools and the execution of the procedures, and about the persons carrying out those procedures and using those tools. So you see this image on the side just shows you the life cycle. You have a business goal, you identify the machine learning problem, and then you process the data that are necessary to develop the model, and this can be an iterative approach, and then you develop the model, then you monitor, and then you find out it doesn't work, so you go back to model development, then you go back to data processing, and so on. Now, you need information about everything that you do along all this loop. So you may have understood from now that there is a difference between metadata and paradata. Metadata are data about the data or a record which are needed to search and display or analyze those data or records. Paradata instead is about methodologies, processes, and persons associated with production and assembly of data records. Now, these are examples of paradata. There are two categories. There are technical paradata and organizational paradata. The technical ones are quite obvious. What is the model that we have tested and selected? How we have evaluated it? What are the logs generated? What are the training parameters, etc. The organizational paradata are, what is the policy? What are the design plans? What is the training of the employee? What are ethical consideration, impact assessment, implementation process, regulatory requirements, etc. So there are briefly three types of AI environment that we deal with, and the difference among them relates to the participation of human beings in what AI does. So the first one is one in which there is no participation by human beings. So you have sensors that measure the real world. These measurements are fed and inform the control processes of AI, and these determine the responses to the real world data. And then the actuators execute these responses. And this is a feedback loop that keeps going. But in the first one, there are no humans. So think of the vacuum cleaner as an example. The second one, humans are indirectly involved because the system makes recommendations. The human may decide to accept them or not, but that's how it is. And the third one is when there is equal involvement of human beings and AI tools. And Tracy Loriot will talk about digital twins, which are a typical example of this shared agency. So shared agency means there is a concurrent action, maybe of humans and tools, and that can be different, disjoint, joint, in conflict, etc., or one at a time action. At one point, the human hands off the ability to act to the tool, or vice versa. Or an emergency decides who comes into play. So that's the accountability issue. Who makes the decision? Until you know who makes the decision, you can't hold this body accountable. So the issues related to the fact also that these are environments that have time constraints. The humans have to act in real time. And it is collaborative or maybe competitive. Different degrees of autonomy, accountability for what action by whom. So documentation is needed and needs to be a mix of continuous, sampled, and event-based on predefined trigger points. And must be based on that feedback cycle model that I showed you before. and it has to have a temporal dimension. In conclusion, the decisions made and actions taken by AI-enabled systems and tools must be documented and preserved, not just documented, you have to keep them. And this, Tracy will mention how difficult it may be. Some of the documentation will be automatic because the AI system or tools will provide it automatically. Some of it is created by humans, but once for all, because, for example, the policy of the organization, the regulations that control the situation, etc., you don't need for every action that you take to repeat them. So it's limited the number of paradata that must be created for each specific use, but it is necessary. So today you will hear in details the various studies, and thank you. Corinne is very anxious because I got a 29. Okay. All right. I guess no questions.
No questions at this time. Luciana will be here to speak with people in person at lunchtime if people have questions for Luciana. Pia. So now, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, the author of our next presentation, Dr. Emanuele Frontoni, unfortunately is unable to be with us. I'll just give a brief introduction of him. Dr. Frontoni is full professor of computer science at the University of Macerata and the co-director of the VRAI Vision Robotics and Artificial Intelligence Lab. His research interests include computer vision and artificial intelligence, extended reality, and digital humanities. We don't have Dr. Frontoni with us today, but I'm very, very happy that we do have his postdoctoral student, Francesca Villani. So I'm going to have her come up and give this presentation. So you can just use that.
Okay, thank you very much, Corinne, for the introduction. I bring you the greetings from Professor Frontoni, which was not able to join us today, but he was sad about that, but it is what it is. So I will start from a brief introduction of myself so that you can understand why I'm here and who I am. So I am currently a postdoc researcher at the Department of Information Engineering in Ancona. And actually, my background is very different from archival science and also from computer science because I am a biomedical engineer. I studied both the bachelor's and the master's in Ancona. And then I started my PhD in humanism and technology at the University of Macerata. And during my PhD, I was involved in research projects abroad, in particular one in Spain, in which I conducted my visiting period, and another one in collaboration with the University of Minho in Portugal. So actually, I'm due to defend my thesis next week, my PhD thesis, yeah. And I want to take 1 minute to thanks especially Professor Sanja Selian, which is here, for reviewing my thesis, and also Professor Mohamed Abdul Majid and Professor Zeljko Pusic. Sorry if I'm not able to pronounce your name correctly, but anyway, so which the two of them will be part of the evaluation committee next week. So we will see again exactly in a week. So now I will start with this, with the presentation, let's say, and I will talk about a case study, which maybe most of you will already know, which is Perganet, and the goal of this presentation is basically to illustrate which is the old story of the project, so where the project comes from, and later I will introduce the future perspective of the study, which probably will be the most interesting part of the presentation, let's say. So as you may already know, the project started from the assumption that archives can be taught as a novel way of using data. In fact, we can consider archives like the ancestors of big data. So starting from this assumption, we can delve deeper in the so-called appearance-based analysis of archival science. why appearance-based archival science? Because when we work with complex data, such as the one you see in the picture, so parchments and piece of historical data from archives, is needed a more complex approach. So this project is not focused only on the well-known optical character recognition, but rather on appearance-based approaches in which we rely on visual information to recognize objects, patterns, and so on. So, and specifically the project focus on the analysis of ancient parchments, which include signs, stamps, graphics, text, and so on. So the starting point of this study was a new way of analyzing documents based completely on deep learning approaches. So the research question from where we started was the understanding of shapes, signa, position of text, the effect or missing part in the images, and so on. So everything that is contained in these kind of images, but not relying only on OCR. So relying instead of appearance-based approaches. So driven by this idea, the research question was if it was possible to create a sort of signa tabellorum in which images were taken from a large part of digitalized parchments, as the ones you can see here in the picture. Here you can see also example of signa, which are contained in the parchment and which are part of the piece of information of which I was talking about 2 slides ago. So the piece of information that we are looking for to understand the semantic meaning of the signa in this case. So starting from this library of signa, one of the aim of the project was to design a catalog of signa, relying on the collaboration with a net of state archives. The one you see here in the picture comes from the State Archives of Milan, in which you can see different kind of signa, one under the other, and each one is very different one from each other. Among these archives, this net of archives, this is the so-called matricula of Milanese Notarium, in which are shown, as I said, a lot of different signa. So the collaboration with this net of archives led to the collection of a big data set, which is already a big contribution of the project, because as all of you know, without data, without the primary source, we cannot develop AI model and we cannot move the research forward. So why I'm talking about this preliminary stuff? Because it is well known that to design a deep learning or an artificial intelligence framework, data are fundamental. So it's fundamental to collect and label and prepare the data. So the data preparation represents the start point of every artificial intelligence project, artificial intelligence approach. So moving forward on this idea, moving forward on the development of this project, we can consider it as composed of 3 main layers. The first one is to classify recto and verso of a document. The second one is to perform text detection on the classified documents. And then finally, the third step is the signa detection system. So in particular, this last part of the project, so signa detection system, can be thought as a sort of semantic annotation model, semantic annotation approach. So starting from the first part of the project, so the classification of recto and verso, we used a very common and very well-known architecture in the computer science field, which is the VGG16, which is a artificial intelligence model used for classifying images. And in this case, it was used to classify recto and verso of the documents. The model was trained on this kind of images, and as you can see, each image is characterized by its own characteristics, and each image is very different one from the other. So this was one of the challenges of the of this first part of the project. Then going forward to the second part, to the second step, the idea was to understand and to see if it was possible to perform text detection. It's not that visible from the image, but you can see probably some colored square all over the image, and they represent the location, let's say in the image, of where the text is. And so in order to distinguish between text, graphics, and other semantic concepts contained inside the images. Also in this case was used a very well-known approach in the field of deep learning, which is EAST, which is linked there for further investigation if you want. So here are some results again of the approach of parchment text recognition. Unfortunately, the image is not that high quality, so you cannot see the squares, but anyway, the detection is based on the recognition of different part of the parchment, so text, signa, matricula, and so on. Here are some other results, and some more here. Yeah, as I was saying before, parchments are very different one from the other, and each one has its own orientation, its own handwriting. So this was more challenging than classifying recto and verso images. Finally, moving to the third part of the project, which is the signa detection and recognition, it was based on the annotation performed by experts using voxel or other annotation tools in order to provide the semantic information on specific region of the image. From this was formed the so-called notarial matricular annotation table, in which can be recognized different kind of signa, each with its own name, historical information, and so on. And this can be considered as a sort of baseline from which to collect this information and train deep learning model starting from this signa. The results obtained were promising, and you can see in the picture example of predictions. And also here you can see, together with the predictions, or where in the image there is a signum, also the confidence with which the model predicts the signa. So as you can imagine, this task is not simple, is not trivial, as each image can be different one from the other, or as we can see in the top corner, that can be signa that overlap to each other. So it was particularly challenging to perform this third part of the project. So this was more or less where we started, where the project started, and now we will move on which is the direction that the project is taking now. So moving to the forward perspective of this study. As it is known, in the field of AI, there is a dynamic and dramatic changes that occur very quickly. In this case, the idea is to follow the trend of new developed AI technologies and understand and see if it is possible and how generative AI and prompt-based AI can be translated to Perganet. So following the trend of cooperative AI, which refers to a system in which multiple AI agents collaboratively generate content, solve problems, or perform tasks by leveraging their collective intelligence, often through iterative refinement and human AI teaming solution to achieve a common goal or enhance the quality of the output. So how can we translate this concept of cooperative AI to Perganet, which was named as Perganet V2 or Perganet 2, as you will see in the slide from now on. So the idea is to use this kind of framework that are already applied to other fields of computer vision and AI, so move Perganet to a sort of vision language model following the trend of the computer vision community. So this new research, from this started a new research question, which is, can we design a specialized vision language model for the appearance of, for appearance-based archival science tasks? And if we look at this model, the idea is to use and to combine generative AI and vision language model to move the research to a sort of prompt-based approach. A prototype of this transition model will be developed, and it will be based on prompt-based approach, that can change the way in which we approach and use deep learning software. Thus, for example, we could ask Perganet V2 to ask, for example, a prompt which is detect signa, percentage of text, and estimate datation of the following parchment. Then we pass the image of the parchment that we want to analyze, and the result that we expect is something like this, like we have in the slide written in red. So something like the picture report, the signa detection results, each notarium ID is reported in the attached table, and the percentage of text is 73% estimated, datation is AD 1330. So, as I say, the idea is to move from a system that performs image analysis, text detection, and so on, to a vision language model which is prompt-based. So moving to the conclusion of this speech, of this presentation, it is important to mention the ethical aspect of this transition. In fact, as we develop Perganet V2, we want to develop it in a ethics by design environment. What does this mean? This means that each time that a part of Payplan of this new version of Perganet is designed, it is designed according to the principle of trustworthy AI, which are displayed here in the slide. How this reflects to the new application of this project. For example, when we will choose which kind of tool we want to use for, I don't know, from which VLM we want to start, we will choose the more transparent one, the open access one, and so on. So the idea is to design a framework for which each part of the Payplan is inserted in an ethics by design approach. So finally, the application could be in the future translated also to other fields such as healthcare or 3D point clouds. And so the main goal, the main idea is to collect novel archival data sets that can be used as benchmarks to create suitable AI application, and also always considering privacy and ethics aspects. So the final objective, we could say, is that while building the alliance between AI and computer scientists and archival science, we take into account the ethical and privacy concernment. So we want to move forward together at the same step, both the ethical and the trustworthy AI part and the technical part. I thank you all for the attention, and here is my mail and one of Emanuele Frontoni, and thanks again, everyone.
We do have time for questions, if people have questions for Francesca.
How would you recommend, or do you have some experience related to the size of data sets and the collection of data sets for your models?
Repeat the question.
Okay, first. The question was if I have idea of the size of the data set and how the data set is collected. Yeah, okay. So I'm more oriented in medical imaging, as you already know, because it was what is my field of study. But anyway, as we move to VLM, the data set size will increase. I mean, the data set needed is bigger than the one of, I would not say traditional, but supervised learning model. Why? Because with supervised learning deep learning model, we provide to the model both the image and the label, and then from there we retrieve the prediction. While for VLM, which are based on transformers, basically, we need more data to retrieve the information from the data without providing the label. So I would say that the dimension of the dataset will increase with time while using this kind of model. So this is why one of the contribution of the project is to create benchmark dataset of archival data, so that they can be used from the community, scientific community, to develop their own model.
The data was taken from archives, right?
Yeah, from state archives of Milan and others of the Italian networks.
You were mentioning that this approach could be applied to 3D spaces as well. Could you explain a little bit more about the challenges
Yeah.
of going from 2D to 3D?
Yeah, okay. So one of the first challenging that comes to my mind is the dimension of the data. So when you adding a third dimension to the data, you know that the how to say the space needed to both train the model and store the data is increasing. Yesterday we were talking about green AI. I don't know if with yours, with someone else, but anyway. So one of the challenges that comes to my mind is to consider also in an ethical and trustworthy aspect the concept of training data, considering also the expensive in terms of energy consumption and so on. So this is one of the first challenge that comes to my mind. Also, the complexity of data increases when you add that dimension. And in the case of point cloud, is even more difficult because it's not like, I don't know, I come to my mind the MRI images, which are 3D volumes, but with point cloud is even more complex. So these are the main and the first challenge that comes to my mind when talking about this. Thank you.
Yes.
Can I, as the archivist, approach the program element and I will find parchments so that I can research it?
No, I didn't understand. Sorry,
So
I
think
didn't.
the question is, can you, as the archivist of this location,
Yes.
use this model and use it with your own parchments and
Oh, I
in
see.
your own?
So if you can use this model to test on your own data, I think, yeah, I mean, surely you can. I don't know if it is already publicly available, the model, but I think it will be because, as we said, in the community, we usually release the model. So yes, definitely you can use it to train on your channel. You can use in two ways. You can use to directly test on your own data and probably will not get a perfect result, but then you can use the model and optimize on your own data, and then from that you will probably improve the result that you get. Yeah.
So the idea for all of the products of InterPARES is that they will be available. I don't think it's
I don't know if it's
available
already-
yet.
yeah,
I don't think
yeah.
so, but theoretically, yes, at some point, you will have access to this tool to use in your own context. My follow-up question, if I may, is how easy is that going to be for an archives? Like what kind of technical expertise will the archival team need to implement this tool in their own archives?
I think it would be necessary to have a multidisciplinary background, not background, but competencies, because you need to be able to understand what is the archival process behind retrieving an image like that, and also a bit at least of how the deep learning model works, how to use them, how to interpret the results, and to, at least to have an idea of what you can do with these tools.
Other questions? Okay, thank you
All
very
right, thank
much.
you, thank you.
Does anyone have a quick question for Luciana before we move to the next presentation? No questions, okay. In that case, I would like to introduce Eng Sengsavang. Eng is a reference archivist, or the reference archivist, at the UNESCO Archives in Paris. She holds dual master's degrees in Archives and Information Studies from the University of British Columbia, and she is the co-author with Jens Boll of Record Keeping in International Organizations, Archives in Transition in Digital Networked Environments, which is one of the books resulting from InterPARES Trust, the previous phase. So please, Eng.
Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you to the Dubrovnik State Archives for hosting us, and to Hervoye and Jelko for helping us to organize, and to InterPARES Trust. And also, thanks to my research partner, Peter Sullivan, who unfortunately could not be with us today. But this presentation is in large part based on his work and I would just like to acknowledge that. So first of all, I'm just going to give you a bit of organizational context because I am coming from a practitioner perspective. I work at UNESCO, which is the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. I'm not going to assume everyone knows what that is, although I understand that Dubrovnik has and Croatia has a certain appreciation for UNESCO, and I find that very heartwarming and great to see the impact that the organization can have in the field. So, you know, some of the most well-known programs of UNESCO are the World Heritage Sites. So the old city of Dubrovnik is registered on the World Heritage List. And then some other well-known programs around intangible cultural heritage. There's some programs around sustainability and the environment all around the world. And it's an intergovernmental organization. So we have 194 member states. The US rejoined recently. So that's just the organizational context. And so what we're talking about today, and the project that Peter and I are working on, is on a set of historical audio archives from the UNESCO archives, which is the institutional archives. And these were produced by the UNESCO Public Information Division over a period of decades, so mostly from the 1940s until the 1980s. There's about 17,000 audio recordings, and these are digitized from reel-to-reel magnetic tape. And it's a challenging and interesting data set because there are over 70 plus languages represented, which makes sense because it's an international environment and there's the UNESCO staff and also the people that it engaged with are from all around the world. So there's a lot of languages and cultures represented in this data set. Also, UNESCO's mission is very broad, so it includes education, culture, sciences, social and human sciences, and media and communications. So this is all represented in the heterogeneity of the data set. So this also means that there's a lot of genres represented and different types of recordings represented in the data set. There's radio programs, interviews, speeches, conferences, meetings and events, and musical recordings. And these are all, I just put up this quote here quickly because just to show how important this idea of radio was in the historical sort of operationalization of UNESCO's mission. It was really seen as a means of mass communication and as a way to reach people and to communicate its values and mission. So it's also an important historical data set for the organization and for what it was trying to accomplish. So the recordings were digitized between 2017 and 2022. And the problem that we had, or the challenge, is that sometimes there was very little metadata attached to the recordings. And sometimes the metadata was incorrect or incomplete. So for example, within a particular recording, sometimes not all of the speakers or even the major speakers were listed. Sometimes names were spelled incorrectly. Sometimes the metadata was even just simply wrong about what was in the recording. And also, the decision was made to describe and create the metadata after the digitization. And this is because in some cases, we could not know what the content of the recordings were until we could listen to them. And because we didn't have that playback machinery for listening to the reel-to-reel magnetic tape, we had to digitize before we could know what they were and confirm what they were. So to date, there's only 1,000 audio recordings described and published online out of the 17,000. So that's kind of the big challenge that we're facing. So the kind of practical questions that we're coming with are, can AI models and tools support and improve the processes of archival description and metadata creation with the aim not only to preserve over the long term, but also make the records accessible for a general public, because this is a public data set, even though there may be some copyright issues. And can AI tools return accurate results and save staff time? And then, of course, what are the risks and challenges when introducing AI into archival description? The larger project goals in terms of the academic study are to contribute to the understanding of the relationship between a physical record and its digital surrogate. And this is directly related to sort of the broader framework of the idea of digitization. So, creating a digital copy of a physical object for which there are standards and guidelines to ensure that when you're creating a digital surrogate, it's a viable product that can be preserved over the long term, and it can stand in for the original physical record. So when you bring AI into that, there's also products like transcripts and translations that sort of are added to that ecosystem of the digital surrogate. And how do you think about that and ensure that there's a connection between, there's still that sustainable connection between the physical and the digital. We also wanted to evaluate whether diplomatic analysis can help with machine learning, and I'll talk a little bit about that after. And then always, both practical and academic is evaluating the potential risks, biases, and benefits. So we identified 4 different types of metadata enrichment that AI could potentially contribute to. So the first one was spoken language identification. It's just not humanly possible for somebody to understand 70+ languages and be able to describe and contribute metadata when there's nothing already existing. There's also transcription. So at the moment, our workflow is that staff will listen to the recordings in order to get an idea of what it's about and in order to be able to generate metadata about it. But that's a labor-intensive process. It takes time. So automatic transcriptions could speed up the process because instead of listening in real time, you're scanning something quickly, is the idea behind that. There's also speech translation to English, which could help, again, with staff when they're describing records and can't understand, all of the 70+ languages, or even a very small percentage of those. And then there's summarization. So as part of our metadata requirements for publishing audio recordings online, we have to produce a 1 to 3 sentence description, summary of the recordings. And so maybe AI could help us to generate a description, a summary of each recording. So this is just a summary of the metadata enrichment plan. And we've highlighted just the 4 different types of actions, AI-supported actions we would like to experiment with. And these are other types of metadata as well that are part of our metadata schema for describing the audio recordings. And then, so I'm just going to quickly summarize what we've done so far. So the first one is on transcripts and translations. We generated a first set of audio recordings, a first set of transcripts and translations using a combination of machine translation and ASR, audio speech recognition. So the initial testing with Whisper, OpenAI's large language model, is that for high resource languages like French and English, the transcriptions were quite reasonable if the language ID was accurate. If there was no language ID, then that the quality of the transcriptions and the translations decreased considerably. We also found, though, that even with English language or high resource languages, speaker names and abbreviations, the AI models had difficulties with that. So then the next thing we experimented with was language identification. And I'm making this sound like it's, phased, like we did this and then this. I think it's all kind of happening at the same time and all related. And again, Peter's doing this work. So thankful for that. So often the languages were not identified or were simply indicated as multilingual in our metadata, in the existing metadata. And there could also be multiple languages in a single recording. So in an initial test for which we had the feedback also of a focus group, we found that recordings that were identified as Welsh were actually in English. And recordings that were identified as Galician, which is, kind of a dialect of, or closely related to Portuguese, were actually Spanish. So, and these are apparently known problems with some of these large language models like Whisper. And then in this focus group, we also had some feedback from our Croatian colleagues about Balkan languages. So for example, some Serbian or Croatian languages were listed in the metadata as Serbo-Croatian, which was also related to the political situation at that time. And nowadays they would be identified as separate languages. We're also doing some experimentation on accented speech, because a lot of the people in the recordings, they speak multiple languages, and when they're switching from their native language to another language that they speak, often there's an accent. So we examined the performance of several off-the-shelf language ID tools on a set of second language English speakers from Europarlament and UNESCO audio recordings. And some of the results were very interesting. So just to give an example, this is Vittorino Veronese, the UNESCO Director General from 1958 to 1961, who is the highest person in the organization. And he speaks 5 languages. So there are recordings of him in French, Italian, Spanish, English, and German. And so we found that these are the English language ID results when people are speaking English as their second language. And so Peter did this on Whisper Large version 1, version 2, and version 3. And you can see version 3 does quite a decent job. But then the Facebook's MMS did quite shockingly poorly, actually, on this test. It's pretty extreme. So that was also very interesting in terms of, how spoken speech actually works. And then when the data set was applied to both native language and second language speakers, the results were much better, especially for Facebook's MMS. So in terms of, there's another experiment that Peter is doing called speaker identification. And basically he's exploring the robustness of speaker recognition tools. I'm not gonna go into too much detail on this. He's done a lot of work on it, and he's sort of presented on this in other contexts, but basically he's looking at extracting a representation of a speaker's voice from a recording. So it's sort of like a unique vector. And the representations ideally capture sort of like a neutral representation of the speaker's voice. But it also, what Peter has found is that it also captures linguistic, age, and gender bias. So there are, when individuals age, their voices change. And this is kind of a known problem for speaker recognition tools, especially in archival contexts when you're working with a historical data set that runs across decades. And in some cases, we have speakers that are that are recorded over a span of 20 years. Like, for example, a director general who's active during his term and then is recorded again, like 10 years later in an interview, or is involved still in some way. There's also issues such as code switching. So if somebody changes the way that they speak in order to mirror or sort of, naturally kind of, is influenced by the context in which they're speaking, and the way that they speak changes, that happens as well. Or again, as we were just talking about, when they're speaking a different language that isn't their native language. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is diplomatic analysis for summarization. So what you're seeing here is, yesterday we had a great tour of the State Archives of Croatia. They have some incredible materials in the museum right next to us. And this is a contractual document of the Hungarian-Croatian King Ludovic I. Just a pause for soccer. Oh, last day of school. Oh, okay. I thought it was soccer related, but okay. So, so I put up this picture, this photograph, and I actually have another photograph of, because I'm a bit humble speaking about diplomatic analysis in front of Luciana Duranti, who is, who, as we know, is one of the greatest scholars of diplomatic analysis. Also, Corinne taught me diplomatic analysis. But I have a picture of Luciana explaining to some of our colleagues the form of this document and how it sort of relates to its meaning. So, for example, Luciana was saying yesterday that like it's horizontal, and horizontal documents versus a vertical scroll, that means something. And then also you can see it's quite extraordinary because of the seals. There's like the big seal of King Ludovic, and then 10 smaller seals of dignitaries from Ludovic's court. And so, you know, all of these things are, when you look at it and you're like, what do these mean? The answer to those questions can be found in diplomatic analysis. So diplomatic analysis emerged as a science in the 17th century, although it had been, you know, it was used in previous centuries, but it really emerged as a distinct science in the 1600s. And basically it aims to understand and analyze the form of documents, originally for the purpose of establishing their authenticity and to expose forgeries. But it's also very useful for contemporary archivists in the analysis of contemporary records. And, you know, I've been having little conversations with colleagues about how they plan to or would like to use diplomatic analysis for their various research projects. So it's really quite still relevant in terms of how we think about understanding a document. So there's things like extrinsic elements of form, which talk about the physicality of the object or the medium of the object. So it doesn't necessarily have to be physical anymore, but you know, medium, script, special signs. And then there's intrinsic elements of form, which is the internal structure of the document. And it includes different parts of a document that have different purposes for that document. Also includes things like persons and acts, etc. So not going to go into anything more about this, but just to give you an idea of what it is. And so what we're hoping to do, we're hoping to use diplomatic analysis as an approach, as a way of trying to break down some of the audio recordings that we would like AI to help us with, and to label significant structural components of the recordings that could be used alongside AI summarization techniques to describe them. So basically as a way of machine learning, to producing labels for machine learning. Our assumption is that similar types of recordings will have similar characteristics. And the goal is for AI, as I was saying earlier, to be able to help us generate these 1 to 3 sentence descriptions. So this is these are human generated descriptions of the audio recordings, just to give you an idea of what kind of thing we're looking at. They're a little bit more detailed than they have to be. These were done by UNESCO Archives interns, but this is sort of an idea of what we're aiming for in terms of, can AI help us with this? So our approach is to first identify genres of recordings, so similar types of recordings, and then to analyze the genres, you know, within their genres, using both audio and transcripts, and to start with the English language recordings and transcripts, just so we're sure that we're working from an accurate base. Because if we start with translated transcripts, you know, there may be some bugs, there may be some inaccuracies. So we're starting with the English language ones. I was talking to Muhammad yesterday, and he suggested 20 recordings per genre to start with, and then later 100 per genre. And we're mostly focusing on diplomatic analysis of the intrinsic elements of form, because that's really, you know, about the internal structure. Although extrinsic elements of form are also very important. For example, language identification is part of the script in diplomatic analysis. So it still comes into play, but for now what we want to do is analyze the internal structure of the recordings. So we've identified a first set of genres. Some of these, I'll talk about this in an instant. Some of these have some overlap. They could be pared down. It's just the approach that we have for now, and it will depend really on our more detailed plan, how we really approach this and what really works. But so, for example, you can see just the range of different types of genres. So there's a speech or a statement. There's an interview where it's a dialogue between two speakers. There's musical programs, which isn't always just music. It's often an expository program about a type of music. UNESCO worked with a musicologist called Alain Danielou, who is quite well known, also has folk recordings, and some of their musical programs were really kind of documentaries about a certain style or tradition of music. And then also structured radio programs, scripted, structured, about a certain topic. So as I was saying, sometimes genres blur. So for example, a UNESCO expert reporting on a mission. Is that a report or a speech or neither? Sometimes a recording seems to belong to one genre, but has the structure of another genre. So for example, Man and His Brain, and I apologize for the titles of these recordings, which obviously they're from the 1960s. I mean, but these were just the ones that came up. So Man and His Brain, it's a radio program with 6 series in that program, but it's structured like an interview. And then there's a recording of the Man in the Space Symposium, which is normally categorized as a conference or an event, but it's really a series of interviews. So so as I was saying, as we keep analyzing the genres more, I think we'll start to develop a way of organizing and categorizing these different similar types of recordings with one another. So just some examples. With interviews, the first 30 seconds almost always include who is being interviewed and about what, and that would be called part of the protocol in diplomatic analysis. Programs reports also generally carry the same information. It says 30 seconds here, but it's sometimes within the first minute, so not always within the first 30 seconds. Because even within genres or similar recordings, the structure or the way that a recording plays out can, vary considerably. And then just for the sign-off, these are the most obvious types of places where, there might be some consistent structure, the beginning and the end. So the last 10 seconds, there's often a sign-off for reports and programs, thanking guests for interviews, and that would be part of the Escada call. So this is kind of an eyesore, but it's just it's my process. So in blue, these are just transcripts of that I've looked at, and in blue is the evocation of the name of the speaker, or of the interviewee, and a very short bio. So often it's like Professor Glenn Sinyi, Professor of Zoology at the University of Lagos in Nigeria. That's a introduction of the name of the speaker and a short bio. And then in pink is generally a short introduction of the main topic. So you can see there's some that are quite long, the summarizations of the topics. There's others that are just like 1 or 2 sentences. And then as we're analyzing these transcripts and the audio recordings, there's also, of course, there's always stuff that doesn't fit into the neat categories that you've identified. So there's, what we call problematic recordings. So speech recordings sometimes begin with no context or introduction to the speaker. So in the example you see here, it literally just starts with thank you, and then applause, and then Madame President, and there's no name introduced. We don't know who's speaking. There's also sometimes unscripted speech at the beginning of recordings because the recordings were digitized raw, and so a lot of it is just kind of filler stuff, like technical rehearsals at the beginning of a recording, or the two people speaking kind of off camera. And sometimes there's no clear-cut statement of a topic, but a keyword is peppered throughout the dialogue. So this is kind of a fun example of one where people are just kind of speaking at the beginning in green. So the interviewer says, would you just say something like recite a line of poetry, see if it comes out all right? And the person says, under the spreading chestnut tree, the village smithy stands. So, okay, and then they start. But that's all stuff that is before the formal part of the program. And then this is another example of something that is an interview, but it starts off more like a dialogue or a conversation rather than kind of like a formal structured interview. So this person who seems very interesting, they are, I suppose they're a pioneer in rockets. And so, they're telling an anecdote about when they first started working with rockets. And there's in pink, there's a lot of the word rocket throughout, but it's not really like a clean, neat statement about what the topic is. So in terms of future steps and considerations, we have to continue the diplomatic analysis and generate a set of labels to train a model on. And then just because I'm, again, always coming from the institutional context, because I work full time. But on the institutional level within UNESCO, think about how we would incorporate this machine-assisted metadata creation into our description workflows, which we haven't done yet. So we're still just in this phase of testing and seeing if a viable product can come out of it. We also will need quality control of the transcripts, translations, and language identification for accuracy, so possibly a crowdsourcing project, because eventually we would like to publish the transcripts along with the digitized audio recordings, because that's a very powerful research tool. But even with a crowdsourcing project, which asks for volunteers to help describe or create metadata, that also requires a substantial quality control process on the part of staff. So. And then, we were talking about paradata. That's something we also have to connect with, is the paradata study, to ensure that we're documenting and asking the right questions as we're going along. But also, eventually, when we do if we do publish any AI-generated metadata, we have to publish a statement that it is AI-generated, and we have to think about how we would like to word that, and then publish the documentation of the process for transparency and accountability. So that's work that we have to do as well on our side. And that's also in line with things like the UNESCO recommendation on the ethics of AI. Yeah, so that's it.
Questions for anyone? Pierluigi.
Yes.
Yes, thank you very much. Each time I heard about this project, I find it more and more interesting. And I was thinking about the musical programs.
Yeah.
I was curious about that. So, in some way, the music that was broadcasted is another object of knowledge, immaterial heritage. Is there a sort of database that set of music as a material heritage within UNESCO, maybe with future steps may connect that music broadcasted with this database?
Yeah, I mean, that would be a good additional data set as well to add. I think that on this website of the Intangible Cultural Heritage Program, they do have a list of intangible heritage, and they also include different media. So they have videos and I suppose also audio recordings and photos of different intangible heritage, which could be anything from music to, bread, like the baguette, or, falconry, or So they do have that on their website, but a lot of it is copyrighted material because it comes directly from the communities that produce those intangible heritage. So, but yeah, that's it would be an interesting connection to make. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and it would be also be contemporary as well, rather than just historical. So, yeah. Thanks. Yes.
Thank you for really great research and very good presentation. So you said that the idea is to take approximately 20 recordings per genre. And how is the methodology? Then we go step by step through the phases like language identification and approximately how much of the time does it take to completely finish the process of elaborating those 20, let's say, recordings?
Okay, so the question was for the 20 audio recordings, what is the process for...
How much approximately does it take to go through all the phases?
Right, yeah. So how much does it take to go through all of the phases?
Like in days, in months, in weeks?
In years?
Well, I think to actually do testing on, like to train a model as a first pilot on, 20 analyses or labels that have been produced out of 20 analyses. It wouldn't take that long, but it's more the time, human time that you have to do it. And also because we're not the AI experts, we rely on the expertise of AI people in the UBC AI lab, like Peter and Muhammad. And so it also depends on their time. So I would say, just to give a very concrete answer, I would say it can take months at least, yeah. But from what I understand, and we have to sit down with Peter and Muhammad to work out the process on their end. But from what I understand, you train on a first test of 20 analysis that comes from 20 transcripts, and then you test it on untrained or unlabeled data. So if I'm getting that right, that's the general, And again, I still have to. We have to plan it out with